final group of speakers is together with Janna Besamusca. Janna, welcome in this webinar. The good thing is that you think this takes a long time and it's complex, but basically we lost a handful of people over the 2 hours, which is really good. And what I hear back from all people is that it's cool, it's interesting, it's unique, it is well, it gives new insights. So don't have the feeling it's a lengthy webinar. Janna, welcome, have the floor, and you have some cool people around you.
I do, absolutely. Thank you, Pauline. So hello, everyone, and thanks for sticking around. My name is Janna Besamusca, and I work at the University of Amsterdam, and I'll be leading the last Q&A that we have here today with index users. And so basically that means this is the panel that asks the question, how do we actually use these indices to change the world? Which I think is probably the coolest question we'll be talking about today. So I would definitely encourage everybody here who's still watching, if you have an answer to the question, what do you need from either the minimum wage database or the labor rights index to be able to do your job better, please put it in the chat. We, of course, also asked this question to our panelists. And today, I have with me Christian Welz, who is a senior research manager of industrial relations at Eurofound. With me is also Martin Gramatikov, who is the director of measuring justice at the Hague Institute for Innovation and Law. And last but not least, Rola Abimourched, who is a senior program director at the Workers' Rights Consortium. I would invite all three of you to turn on your cameras so that everyone can see you. And I would like to start by giving the word to Christian Welz. Please go ahead.
Janna, yes, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for this great opportunity. What do we need to change the world? First of all, we need good data. And I think we do get this good data out of your project. That's really cool. I was looking for a heading for my presentation, and I got it by Kathleen, actually. I was looking for a long time. I think you have a lot of good information there, but what we need to do more is to contextualize. I think that's the one thing that's probably missing. You have 155 countries, 10 indicators, 46 criteria. You have a data set of more than 5,000 data points. That's fantastic. That's really cool. Since I'm working in industrial relations, I like to focus on industrial relations, and on one of your indicators, which is around the trade union indicator. And there you have 4 dimensions. You have the right to organize, the right to collective bargaining, the right to strike, and the prohibition to replace striking workers by others. This is really cool. But again, I think we probably need to contextualize more. When we look into our indicator, the European Industrial Relations Indicator, please have a look, just Google it, European Industrial Relations Indicator of Eurofound. We have one indicator on industrial democracy, one big indicator. And we define industrial democracy as encompassing all the rights of workers and employers, because we're tripartite institutions, so we need to integrate the employers as well in the governance and employment relationship, either directly or indirectly via trade unions, works council, etc. So for this, we have 4 dimensions. We have social dialogue at the national level, at the company level, but we also have representation rights of employees via works councils in the boards. And I think that's something missing in your labor rights indicator. You look into the trade unions, but you're not looking into the micro level. So I think there is need, I think this was mentioned before, there is some room to expand this into the micro level. When we then look into the outcomes of your index and ours, there's huge similarities. We have all the guys, all the countries who do very well. They're the usual suspects. Scandinavia, Finland, Sweden, Central Europe. I'm sorry, I'm talking about Europe here, working for the European Union. So I have this European Union focus on it. So, and then we have Austria, Netherlands, Belgium. But then we have 2 interesting cases, very interesting cases, where your index and ours diverge completely. The Baltic countries, take, for example, Lithuania and Germany. And why is this so? Because I think we do not sufficiently contextualize. Germany loads very poorly in your indicator on trade union. Why? Because Germany does not have a legal right to strike, yet it is in judge-made law. It's there, but you do not have a law on strikes in Germany. So 0 points for Germany in your index. Also 0 points for collective bargaining. I do not understand why. There is a law on collective bargaining in Germany. It's not out there. And then you have, so very poorly in your index, but quite highly in our indicator, because you have all those board level rights, board level participation, strong role of collective bargaining. So I think there is a point where we diverge because the focus is different, and maybe you do not sufficiently contextualize with your labor law index. So we have this issue, and Lithuania, on the other hand, does very well because it has everything in law. But when you look at what Kathleen said, the contextualizing, it does very poorly in collective bargaining coverage, in trade union density, in all those practical industrial relations indicators out there. Lithuania is doing very poorly. So if you only look into this labor law perspective and ask what is the governance of the employment relationship via your index and ours, you get completely different pictures because of the need probably to do a bit more on contextualization. I've almost finished. So what are your aims? You want to be a tool for policymakers, instigate debate, mutual learning, benchmarking. Yes, I think that's very important. But for this, just sometimes, like I said, we need this broader picture. So I think it's a very good idea. I think in the video you were saying this, you want to open this up to another dimension, social dialogue at national level. I think that's a good idea, to have more room for social dialogue. But then again, if you only look into the national level, you might run the risk to forget about the sectoral level. And there's a lot of sectoral level collective bargaining going in Europe, which is very important. In Germany, for example, we have 50,000 collective agreements which set the employment conditions for workers. So that would be my last point. Yes, I think it's super useful, very good. We spoke about the role of collective bargaining already, but again, like with all the other indices out there, there is a utter need for contextualization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian. And you raised some super interesting points that I hope maybe Iftikhar can even respond to some of them already in the chat. But I do also want to move on to the next speaker, Martin Gramatikov. Can I give you the floor, Martin, and ask you also to reflect on how you would use this database, the indices?
Thank you very much, Janna, and congratulations to the creators of the index. And the whole effort is really amazing. I'm not sure the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law, no end law, but innovation of law, is the typical user. But basically what we try to do is to see how the legal systems are not working and to promote innovative solutions. So in that respect, the index certainly has an appeal. And for us, the important thing is to make sure that many justice innovators, think about startups, think about NGOs, think about academic innovators, also innovators in the public sector, are looking and finding this data and then turning it into action. I think it's very important. We do a lot of research at national level, and just a little bit on the opposite of Christian, we do a lot in developing context. We do work a lot in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, etc. And everywhere we go, we see that employment and work is one of the top legal problems that people encounter. So this is just saying why and how relevant the index is. But on the other hand, I want to say that the most frequently occurring problems within employment are things like unfair termination, harassment at work, non-payment of wages, non-payment of social security, discrimination, etc., etc. So I was thinking in that situation, if I am a layperson or I am some sort of innovator on or legal aid organization, what the index will tell me. Will the index tell me where to go to solve my problem? Will the index will tell me what are the mechanisms? And one last point, I want to say that in employment disputes, we very, very rarely see that people receive proper information and advice. Most often people go to their local environment, to family, friends to figure out what to do. Very often people go to employers to find out how to solve a legal problem. And rarely they have access to information, advice to solve the problem. Rarely they go to neutral dispute resolution venues to again solve the problem. So for me, these are all possible ways to continue expand the index if you're thinking about making an impact on the ground from the bottom up. I certainly see the top-down appeal, but I think there is also a lot of perspective for bottom-up use of your index if it develops in such directions. Thank you very much and success.
Thank you so much, Martin. And you raised a super important point here about access to justice and how we can help with that. I can actually, in the panel above, I can see Pauline, also the director of the WageIndicator, almost dancing when she hears your remarks, because this is exactly one of the things that we have websites for and what we want to do also with this index. So thank you for pointing that out. And I'm thinking that we will certainly be in touch to see how we can optimize this function as well. So thank you. And then I would like to invite Rola Abimourched to share her thoughts on the indices and how to use them.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone, and congratulations on these indices. I work with the Worker Rights Consortium. We're an international labor monitoring organization that particularly focuses on the garment sector. I think these, as a lot of the panelists have pointed out, these indices provide a really good resource in terms of identifying minimum wages across the world in different sectors. I see that some of them are broken down, as in a lot of countries, there are different minimum wages depending on the sector. It provides a great overview of labor laws around the world and other relevant laws. I think one thing that a lot of panelists have pointed to is that contextualization. Really, it's not just the fact that there are labor laws in place. I mean, and oftentimes what we're seeing is that there might be some strong laws around, for example, severance. However, in practice, those laws are not implemented. Employers are actively working to suppress freedom of association, for example, failing to pay workers their severance owed, and that there are non-state actors like global brands that also have these voluntary codes of conduct that are supposed to be enforced through their factory monitoring, and that include restrictions and prohibitions on overwork, on harassment and abuse, that require the supplier to pay for severance wages. And in some cases, brands have publicly committed to a living wage. However, what we see is that these codes are not enforced. And so what we're seeing currently with the pandemic is that workers were already in a very precarious economic situation. I mean, the minimum wage is not a living wage, as we all know. It would be at least 3 times the minimum wage in order for workers to be able to survive. Even though brands have committed to a living wage, no action has been taken. And similarly, you know, one thing we can point to is that purchasing practices of brands. And so I think that that is another central point. So you have the national legislation, but you also have purchasing practices and the way that business is done. And that is really an issue, because a lot of times when we're working and engaging with brands after we receive worker complaints, we can see results. We can see that remedies actually taken, that workers are made whole, they are provided their back wages, if freedom of association violations have happened. However, there isn't a systematic way to do this unless brands commit themselves through a binding and enforceable way to actually enforce their codes of conduct. And I think, finally, I don't think we can stress enough how much the global pandemic has really laid bare these structural issues. So what we're seeing is a lot of workers losing their jobs. The WRC conducted a survey of 400 workers. 70% of those workers who had lost their jobs said they only received partial payment of their severance. 40% received no payment. In a situation where they're already in dire economic strains, this adds additional set of problems for workers who may not be able to afford food for themselves and their families. And so I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful that you bring up also the issue of implementation, but also the issue of negotiating agreements, coming to codes of conduct and implementing those, also because, as you may remember from the video that was introduced at the beginning of this webinar, some of the things that we hope that these indices can achieve is to be a kind of starting point for reform. So I was wondering if you would reflect a little bit, Rola, on whether you think that knowing your rights, or basically having these codified rights in front of employers that you are working with and workers that you are trying to help, does that give you a way forward? Does that help you in negotiations, for example?
I think, generally the problem is an imbalance of power. So obviously there's some worker education that's necessary, but oftentimes what happens is you might know that you should not be threatened and that you should be receiving the pay that you're legally required to receive. However, if you don't have a union backing you, or if that union is facing interference and repression from the employer, it's really hard to assert your rights. And I think, again, we talk about a lot of times the responsibility of those at the top of the supply chain. And really, if the brands are cutting down on price, if they're turning a blind eye to certain violations that are really hard to identify through social audits, like freedom of association, like gender-based violence and harassment, it's really hard to enforce that down the chain. And it's really hard to demand that as a worker. So one area we really advocate is that really brands need to rethink their pricing structures and really increase those prices so that then allows suppliers to pay a living wage to workers and allows there to be some sort of safety net created so that when, let's say, a factory closes, there is a pool of funds for workers to pull to receive their severance benefits.
Thank you very much. I also have a question to, I think that goes in the direction of both Christian's and Martin's work. One of the things that we look at here, or that's been mentioned a couple of times throughout this webinar, are the assumptions of this index, right? So the labor rights index is assuming that people have worked at a place for about a year, are documented, work in the formal economy, things like that. Having that in mind, Martin, the people that you are trying to help gain access to justice, and Christian, the living wage or the decent work comparisons that you are making, does that still help you do those things, or should we rethink the direction of the index?
Well, the assumptions are certainly restricting a lot the way to which the index can be implemented in the real world, but also I understand that analytically these are needed. So it's there are a lot of populations which will certainly in which these assumptions will not be holding. I will not go into detail. Another thing I just wanted to mention, it's not super related to that, but in many of the countries where we work, in regions where we work, the employment problems and problems on land ownership are very much interrelated because huge proportions of population work on subsistence farming. So I wanted to just make a brief reference to that, in Ethiopia, for instance, you can see a relatively low prevalence of employment problems, but these are actually masked as land disputes. So this is something that empirical research is clearly showing.
Thank you very much. Christian?
Yes, very briefly, Janna. Good question, of course. I think those assumptions make sense for analytical reasons. I think they definitely cause less problems for Europe than they cause for other parts of the world, because we're mainly talking about typical forms of work. Yet, as we all know, there are more and more atypical forms of work with platform economy, etc. So I think they cause less of a problem for Europe than, like Martin was saying, for other parts of the world. So I think Europe can live with those assumptions more easily.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, Christian, Martin, Rola, for joining us here today. We ran out of time for this panel. Rola, I would say to you still that there is a question to you in the chat. So if you would have a look at that, that would be fabulous. And in the meantime, I would like to pass the word back to Pauline.
Thanks a million. Thanks for your nice panel. And in the end of the answer, still we didn't lose that many people. So it's actually pretty good what we, and it's a topic, well, it's a nerdy topic, but I would say it's for geeks, for freaks as well. The issue which we discuss, it's very unique. And to do that on a Friday afternoon with so many people, it's amazing.